So welcome to another episode of the Addy Hour. Today, I'm honored to be able to host co-founder of March for Our Lives, David Hogg. And today we're going to be jumping into a conversation, really talking about activism, self-care, and ending gun violence. Now, I know for those of you in the audience, a lot of you are probably familiar with David. You're familiar with his work and his efforts. And I think today it'll be nice to really peel back a little bit and talk about some of the things that he's been involved in, some of his goals, but also about him as a person and some of the things that he's really trying to elevate in terms of really making sure that the work that others are doing on the ground in a lot of ways is also highlighted as well. So really excited to jump into this conversation. Obviously, David is someone who was thrust into activism following the tragic and unfortunate shooting at his high school in Parkland, Florida in 2018. And from that event, he and his classmates have really vowed to be game changers and change makers in a lot of ways. And he's resolved that no other young person should have to experience the tragic impact of violence, of gun violence in particular. So as I mentioned, he's the co-founder of March for Our Lives. They've been involved in lots of different initiatives over the years. Just to highlight a few, the march they had in Washington, D.C., where he spoke to an estimated 800,000 protesters. He and his sister Lauren are also authors. They co-authored Never Again, which became a New York Times best-selling book. They also contributed to the book Glimmer of Hope, How Tragedy Sparked a Movement. And they've been involved in lots of different efforts over the years, touring across the country, really meeting families and individuals who've had losses at the hands of gun violence, and just also educating themselves about ways to really make an impact. David's also someone who has a pretty large social media following, and he really uses his platform to promote civic engagement, activism, and voting. So again, just grateful to have David here on the Addy Hour episode today. David, thanks so much for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course. So again, a lot of people know about you, maybe not know a lot about you in terms of on the personal level. But one of the things that I really like to do on this program too is always just to check in with folks. I think it's important to remind people that you're also a student. So, in the middle of all this work that you're doing, you've also been taking classes, you're coming to the end of the semester. So I actually just wanted to start out and see how things are with you these days in the midst of everything that's going on in the world, as you're wrapping up the semester, just in your daily life. How are you doing these days?
Yeah, I would say I'm pretty good. Just trying to figure out, I don't know, it's kind of weird because when you take time off of school or work, I think a lot of people have this feeling where it's like, you don't have things to be stressed out about anymore, but you still have the stress for some reason, So I've been dealing with that. And I've just been thinking a lot more about what I want to do in the future. Just because I'm now halfway through my 4 years of college, and thinking about different opportunities and stuff, internships and things to do. Even though I really honestly I wish I could just take time off and not do anything for a minute, because it's I think my generation especially, but pretty much Americans in general, have an arguably unhealthy obsession with doing as much as possible, and don't really value spending time with friends and family as much as I think we should, because we think in a very almost hyper capitalistic manner, that can really kind of hurt a lot of our friendships, relationships, and our family relationships overall. Although I think a lot of us have been able to spend more time this year with our families and everything. For some of us, perhaps too much, but I think I'm doing pretty good overall. Just trying to be more accepting of not necessarily knowing what I'm going to do in the future, even though I know it'll be something vaguely political or in communications or whatever. Being more accepting of the unknown and kind of embracing it and taking care of myself while I'm doing that.
Right. Well, I appreciate your honesty in that, and I think that's really healthy in a lot of ways too. But I think it's good that you're being honest with yourself and also highlighting the tension between all the work that needs to be done, but then also knowing that it's still good to slow down, spend time with family and friends, but there's not always an easy answer. So I think just even the fact that you're verbalizing it, because I think for a lot of us, sometimes it's easy, like you said, not to verbalize it and just go kind of 1,000 miles an hour and not even take that time to pull back. So I mean, on that note too, you all have been. I think part of it's just because you all have been it isn't baked in the culture, like you said, but all the important work you all have been doing over the last 3 years. So I just, just to kind of pull back a little bit, what's that been like, would you say, for the last 3 years being David Hogg? I know that sounds like a like a cheesy question, but I really just wanted to kind of get
Right.
a sense or a capturing of what that journey has been like for you.
I mean, it's certainly had its ups and its downs. I would say that it's been really amazing to see how my friends and I are able to take an idea, like doing a march on Washington or talking about youth voting, and really help turn it into reality. Although we were by no means the only people that talked about youth voting, for example. It's been incredible to see the achievements we've had over even the past 3 years, with one of the highest youth voter turnouts in 2018 of any, non-presidential midterm. And really the highest youth voter turnout in American history in 2020. It's pretty remarkable. But I think those are some of the high points. I think some of the lower ones, though, are, as I kind of talked about earlier, that unhealthy obsession, like hyper-capitalistic obsession with productivity, and like that being the only thing that matters, paired with the trauma and survivor's guilt of going through shooting, and talking to all these people that have experienced gun violence on a daily basis, literally probably tens of thousands of people at this point. The pairing of those two things is a really dangerous combination that I've seen hurt a lot of people that I know that have worked in what I would call the peace advocacy space. Because the work that we do is very important, but sometimes because it is so important, we lose sight of how important we are and the importance of taking care of ourselves in this, because of that guilt, because of that PTSD and that trauma-driven response. I think I've certainly had my own, challenges with that. Not just because of like notoriety or attention or whatever, much of which, quite frankly, is because Parkland is a predominantly white community that's more affluent than the average community. But it's also because I share a lot of that, unhealthy obsession with productivity. And the longest time, I really looked at the work that we were doing like a campaign. I thought in 2018, we're just going to work 36 hours a day, basically, every single day, and not stop for anything. And literally work oftentimes until we got physically, sick to the point that we couldn't work anymore, which happened multiple times to me. And I know happened to others that we worked with. But it's really taken me broadening that view and realizing that my self-care and hanging out with friends and talking to people isn't something to feel guilty about. It's something that's a necessity. It's part of my productivity. Because it's not like a campaign where it's a sprint. You have November 3rd or whatever date it is that you're going to finish by. We don't know when gun violence is going to end. It's much more accustomed to, an ultra marathon where we don't know the ultimate destination, and there's a lot of wrong paths we can go down. So we really have to pace ourselves and be even prepared to pass on the baton to the next generation, although I hope that's not necessary. So it's been a lot over the past 3 years. It's felt like a lifetime. So much travel, so many, people that I've met, so many experiences. And I really had to challenge myself to figure out how to prioritize myself and putting on my oxygen mask first before I can help anyone else. And it's difficult when we have this obsession with constant achievement and constantly doing more and more and more and more. And being obsessed with productivity instead of realizing the importance of, and it sounds super cliche, and I mean, I kind of hate the term, but like taking care of yourself, because we hear it all the time, but I never really understood what that meant until, the past year or two. But because of that, I've really been able to take care of myself and take a step back and think about how do I want to enter the space instead of what are all the holes that I need to fill in. So that's kind of what the past 3 years have been like. I actually struggled a lot with PTSD, not just from the shooting, but actually from activism, in, the threats, in the harassment, in even how hard we were working at times, like getting 4 hours of sleep, oftentimes, every day for a month or two it's not healthy, especially when you're a younger person and you need a lot of sleep. And then you have to go in front of people and talk, and then you have to go on the, the news and stuff. And you're concerned that are you taking up too much space? Do you want to uplift, how do you uplift people properly, but not in a tokenistic manner, but how do you still highlight the issues that's going on? And, luckily, because going to therapy for basically the past year and a half, I've really been able to start focusing much more on taking care of myself and consistently, checking my bases every day of like, it seems ridiculous, but just eating, drinking, getting enough sleep, and focusing on those basic core things until I can really start to build on top of that foundation to become more productive, but in a healthy manner.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's so important. I mean, I think there's a lot of maturity there too, and growth along the way. And that, not to say that you weren't mature early on too, but just even the way that you kind of characterized, like you were going 1,000 miles an hour at the beginning, then you're realizing where you need to pull back, where you need to have that self-care. But, I imagine that's still not easy, because in some ways, I think that's what feeds a cycle. Because, the less sleep, the more work you do, the more outcome and the more output you can see. So I'm curious, like, how did you move along that? Because in some ways, it's almost like you had to sacrifice some of the work to be able to take care of yourself. And you talked about having that long-term trajectory. But I imagine that's still a tension, because it's like, well, I'm not doing this work, I'm pulling back, so X, Y, and Z is not getting done. So how have you reconciled that in your mind?
I think the main way I've reconciled it is realizing that I think because we have a very individualistic culture, we have a tendency to get very self-absorbed in the work that we do and think that we're the only person doing the work. I think that applies to all of us, honestly, because, we're all the stars of our own reality TV shows in some sense, in our mind. I think what it took me realizing was it was truly effectively delegating and working to hire people, that were actually qualified to do this work, had experience doing this work in the nonprofit space, and organizing stuff to help do the work within March for Our Lives, where the organization has basically grown, over like basically 8 times, over the past 2 years in terms of like our total number of staff, because we were woefully understaffed and had a severe lack of experience, honestly, with a lot of the work that we were doing. And it's still youth led, but we have people that have more experience, helping execute the plans that young people ultimately come up with in the first place. So that's been the most effective thing, is like hiring other people to do the work that I didn't necessarily need to be doing myself, but I just found myself doing a lot of the time. And then just preoccupying myself with school, because it's, as you can imagine, going to college and traveling every weekend and going on, like, it's just, I kind of had to realize that there's some sacrifices involved in order for me to prioritize really what's best for my future. And that's going to college instead of just, necessarily doing a ton of work every day in this field that in some ways is also just exhausting. It's activism, and a lot of the time it's a really thankless job. And it's difficult because you can believe that even if you do achieve these things, that somehow it's going to like make up for that lack of self-care, but it doesn't. It really doesn't. So yeah, it's been difficult making those decisions, but you kind of have to learn how to say no a lot of the time, even though it's hard. And it feels like it almost feels like, because we're told so often about how important it is to take every opportunity, it kind of feels like you're cutting off your right arm, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
But you have to realize that, even if it does feel that way, ultimately you have to be able to, survive and focus on what's really important. And in my case, that's school.
Yeah.
And it's also the work that March for Our Lives does that doesn't get on the news, focusing on mutual aid, focusing on, the different aspects of racial and economic justice that plays into ending gun violence and stopping people from wanting to pick up a gun in the first place, instead of just talking about how they get the gun.
Yeah.
We have to have a holistic solution here that we talk about. And those conversations, unfortunately, aren't things that are great to fit in sound bites or great to put on the news for a lot of people, because they don't want to talk about the lack of resources that causes a community to, that results in violence and historic and systemic injustice. But that's the work that we're doing. And it hasn't been an easy transition, but I've just realized, I have to take care of myself and focus on what's ahead with school. And been working on a couple cool projects at school too. I worked on there's a public opinion polling project that I worked on this semester for youth.
Oh, nice.
So yeah, it was cool.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, it sounds like you're letting yourself ride that tension too, because there's so much work that has to be done. Even as I'm listening to you talking, I'm sure, this probably hits you too. Like, that's a Herculean amount of work that you're talking about. And that's not something that anyone would be able to do if they're spread too thin. But at the same time, like,
it's certainly no one could do themselves.
Yeah. I mean, would you say that you all have, as a group, have people bought into this idea of self-care, or has it been certain pockets of people? Like how's that? I'm just thinking about, I'm imagining what the vibe was like when you all started and how much energy there must have been as you all were touring across the country. But I'm curious if this shift has kind of pervaded March for Lives, or do you think it's in pockets?
I think it's in pockets. I think it's more like, I think a lot of the time, especially the young people that were involved in the beginning, myself included, but especially for some of the other people that weren't as privileged as me to have like the power of being like, not only like being a guy, but also being like a white straight guy in the first place, like inherently it's going to be a lot easier for me to exist in these spaces than a lot of, other co-founders that were women or non-binary or were, LGBTQ, whatever. And for a lot of them, they understandably just got exhausted and weren't accepting of a space that, wasn't, was just really difficult for them to function in because, young people aren't born with HR experience, unfortunately. Yeah. And in a youth-led organization, I'll say the reason why March for Our Lives has been successful is because it is youth-led, but it's also that very same youth-led energy that can also end the organization because it's the combination of a lot of energy and kind of adhocracy paired with a lack of experience, to be honest, can be really, really damaging. So a lot of the co-founders have, taken a step back, which I think is fine. I think we see that throughout these movements. There are people that take years off at times and step back in. And, honestly, even if some of the co-founders don't ever want to do this work again, they've done more than 99.9% of people will ever do in their lives around this issue. So I'm forever thankful for that. And I can't blame them because ultimately, I want them alive. That's what it comes down to, because this work is really hard for these young people. So I think a lot of them were either like myself, were forced to learn about self-care by, to use a metaphor, kind of like, you can tell someone to not put their hand on a hot stove a lot of times, but sometimes it takes getting burned to really realize the importance of not doing that. And I think that may be the case. No, I don't mean to generalize, but I think it is the case with a lot of young people, especially traumatized young people that care so much, understandably, about this issue. But yeah, so a lot of the co-founders have taken a step back to focus on the arts, focus on theater, focus on college, which is totally valid. And I'm never gonna blame them for that. But I think as an organization, we've gotten a lot better at focusing on that self-care aspect. We do a lot more workshops and trainings around it and stuff now. But unfortunately, when it is young people, there is some element of needing to learn it the hard way, at least in my case. Because I can't tell you how many times I was told to, make sure you're taking care of yourself. And I didn't understand. Yeah. I always heard that, but I didn't understand what that looked like for me until I really sat down and started to kind of get reconnected with my emotions and my experiences and stuff. Because I think, especially with guys, I know that I had a tendency in the beginning to just shut out all the emotions and trauma, secondhand trauma that I was, hearing about every day of people, having their loved ones shot, having even their pets shot in front of them, just horrible stuff. Yeah. And just like kind of like blocking it out was, I thought, was the best way of dealing with it, but it actually just piles up, and I actually found myself, I thought the PTSD and the trauma and stuff from activism, from obviously the shooting and stuff was just something that would make me sad, and that's how I would know. But I didn't realize is it just made me numb. I didn't feel anything for the longest time, which was really concerning. It got to the point where every conversation I had was about gun violence, and because I was talking so little to any of my friends about anything else because the work just became our life. Yeah. And what it took for me was really sitting down and journaling every day to get back in touch with my emotions and to process what I'd gone through in the past year, going to therapy and stuff, to understand that those emotions are things that I have to cope with as anyone else does. And it's not just something that you can just block out. So that's been a lot of my journey around the self-care aspect and the co-founders as well, and other students. But, I'd be lying if I said it was easy, and there weren't people that, are hurt, not necessarily by any fault of their own, but just by, we're trying to do the work of a government here, essentially, because our government is not doing this work. And that's not what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to have elected, we're supposed to be college students or high school students. We have elected officials that are supposed to represent us for a reason. And it's exactly so we shouldn't have to do this.
Yeah. And that's so important. I mean, you've hit on so many important pieces there too. But I mean, I think again, just seems like you really got into a good place of just realizing a lot of these things. I mean, kind of the self-reflection, even as you're talking about the journaling, that you're all doing more work than you should be doing, and just all the weight that comes with that. Because even as you were talking about, all the families that you've interacted with across the country, like immediately my mind was going to like, I mean, all those conversations are weighty. And in some ways, I feel like you must have, even if you didn't know, been carrying all that on you too. Because those stories, you hear them over and over, and they're going to penetrate at some point. I mean, it seems like in a lot of ways you're able to kind of channel that energy into the increased activism. Then still you have your own story. You have all these stories that you're carrying with you. And so really having a place to process that, I think, is really important. It sounds like that's been kind of a weekly, daily process for you as of late, just making sure that you have the space for that, which I think is critical, but not always easy to acknowledge in the heat of the moment, in the sense when you're in the middle of the work. So
I mean, I think it's also it's so important to deal with that self-care aspect, because I've seen so many times how in activism, because it I would be lying, if I said it wasn't traumatizing work for a lot of young people, including myself, like, getting followed by people with AR-15s, getting screamed at by them, having your house swatted, death threats that I get, but also a lot of kids that work in the organization and in the gun violence prevention movement, and people too in general, get. That trauma and that exhaustion can end up turning us on each other, because we start to think the reason why we're not being successful is because of people that we're working with, when in reality it's because this, you can say activism isn't easy or social change isn't easy, but it is really, really hard. And it may not it may not necessarily be because of anybody's fault that you work with, but you can start to turn on each other when you're not taking care of yourselves, which I think is a major problem that not just, the peace advocacy space has, but also a problem that social movements have in general, because the work that we do really is incredibly important. But when we're not taking care of ourselves, we can have a tendency to turn on each other and get really negative and act horribly towards each other. And if you don't select times, on a regular basis to really sit down and talk those things out, it piles up and it really starts hurting people.
Yeah. I think that's so important. You all are paying attention to that. So, I mean, even, all the things that you all have been through, I mean, just in general, and people have gone through that, as I mean, it has an effect on people's day-to-day lives, just in terms of like, schoolwork in general. Can they still focus as well? Then you add on all the activism work that you're doing, which has a whole nother heightened level of importance and tension and just weight to it. And you put all that together. So I think, that's so important. That's been at the forefront recently in a lot of ways. I was thinking back to one of the interviews you and your sister did too. One of the things you talked about reminded me of that, just when you all were talking about how the activism was your therapy in a sense. And it seems like what you've been talking about is ways that you're able to kind of channel that and use that as a way to cope. Do you think that was effective and helpful in some ways? I mean, you've kind of talked about the ways where some things were ignored, but you didn't pay as much attention necessarily to some of the self-cares you maybe could have. But what would you say are some of the positives of what you're doing in the activism and how that affected you all as people?
I mean, I actually think sometimes that like massive marches and demonstrations, even if not, directly politically impactful or something like that, I think it can actually be really beneficial in some ways, because people realize they're not alone. And I think that's been one of the biggest benefits that we've seen a lot of social movements, from, feminist movements, historically speaking, to civil rights, to peace, to anti-war movements, is in some ways they're almost like massive, it's certainly not like, certified as group therapy, but in some ways it's kind of like a massive venting session that I think actually can be really helpful for people. I think the issue comes when those individuals continue to focus so much on that and sacrifice stuff to try to end the things that are causing this trauma, that they end up throwing away the things that they love and the people that they love. Not throwing them away. Throwing them away is too hard of a word, but not prioritizing them just as much as the work, and that ends up making them feel really resentful, towards the movement, towards the people that they work with, because they feel like they've sacrificed so much and there's been so little progress, which, honestly, there's been a lot of progress in terms of the historical perspective in gun violence prevention, but on the scale that we need it at, it's been very little, unfortunately. But I think the activism in some ways done properly can be a form of therapy, but done done in a way that causes harm or done in a way that where you're not taking care of yourself can be a form of trauma. When you're throwing away the things that you love and just working on it every single day, and you have, there's no end in sight of when it's going to stop. Right. So yeah, that would be my main way of thinking about it.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I mean, the group therapy piece in particular. I mean, I think there's a lot to that, because there's that, common lived experience that you all had that you can support each other in, and talking to someone who understands it.
Yeah. And there's a lot of power in that, because we feel like we're surrounded, when you're around 800,000 people, even if not all of them have been affected by gun violence, a lot of them have been. Like at the march, for example, those people see each other and they see that they're not alone. And I actually think there's a huge amount of value in that, especially with like the power of the NRA and the people that choose to try to advocate for the rights of inanimate objects over human beings. They're so loud and they have such, strong connection to each other that the people that are actually affected mostly by those actions, that want people and kids to be protected, not weapons like an AR-15, can feel alone, even though we're actually in the majority if you do a poll, of the country in general. And that solidarity and friendship piece and community piece is extremely powerful, because it's that community that enables social movements, I believe, in the long term to succeed. Because at the core of social movement power and the core of political power isn't politics at all. It's culture, it's music, it's storytelling. And it's only in those community spaces when we're around each other that we're able to show love and appreciation for each other and care for each other, even as unfortunately no actions taken, or even, retroactive actions taken. We're able to be there kind of as the bedrock and endurance that is necessary for the sustainability of the movement. But when that community is only working solely on the issue itself and not really hanging out and talking with each other, that's when things, come in. And that's actually one thing I realized in some research that I did this semester. It wasn't necessarily very scientific, but it was just for a history class of mine. I was interviewing different civil rights activists that went to Harvard and worked on like the freedom rides, for example. Wow. And one of them talked about how I won't say his name for privacy reasons, but one of them talked about how when he initially, I think it was like 1963 or something like that, he went down to the South to work on the freedom rides, and he was meeting up with like some young people from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and everything. And he walked in the room as a sophomore at Harvard, I think, and he was expecting a ton of students to be strategizing on a chalkboard and like drawing all this stuff out, talking about policy and everything. But he walked in and, these young civil rights activists, from all around the South were actually having a preach off, seeing who could imitate MLK the best, and dancing and playing guitar and singing together. And one thing he told me is like, how could you see that and not want to be part of that? Right. I think it's that community aspect, hanging out with each other, that music, that really builds successful social movements in the long run. Because ultimately, leaders in social movements can have their own impacts in different ways, but the real power in those isn't just, it's in the culture and it's in the community. Because, it's the best movements are ones where everyone are leaders in the first place, where everybody's able to lead themselves and take care of each other. And it's when we're not doing that, when we're not having fun, it's not sustainable. So that's been a big focus of myself and the organization over the past years, figuring out how can, it's difficult with COVID, but how can we celebrate our wins? How can we, take time to hang out and do things not related to incredibly exhausting and traumatizing work, like trying to stop people from getting shot.
Yeah, that's so important. I mean, the research backs us up too, in terms of the psychology research that's been done, looking at the power of community, even in terms of the neuroscience research, looking at what being in community does to the brain and how it helps with just moving through stressors and resilience. So I think, everything you're saying is spot on in a lot of ways. How would you say you're cultivating that? Because it seems like there's two pieces there. There's both kind of the self-care, the daily self-care, but then also making sure there's the community self-care, and making sure that those are ingrained in a way.
Yeah. So I think one thing that we are trying to do kind of is trying to develop some kind of system to deal with the inevitable grievances that come up between organizers and leaders on an annual basis, where we just talk it out. we talk that out and move on, but it's also the way that I practice it personally is, I just call up friends randomly that I've worked with, which, some people don't like being called or whatever, but, I'll text them or I just like talking to them and stuff. And I ask them, I basically, at some points, I check in with them and I just talk to them casually, but really, it's a good way of checking myself to make sure I'm taking care of myself, but it's also, it's a good way of having accountability for making sure other people are taking care of themselves as well. Because I think if we look at the history of the civil rights movement, unfortunately, because of understandably the incredible amount of trauma and stuff behind it, there's a lot of people, we hear a lot about like the successes of the leaders and stuff and different everyday people that participated. What we don't hear a lot about is, the people that, ended up abusing various like substances and stuff because of the trauma and not being able to deal with it and stuff. And, I don't know how much of that you can, when it's that level of trauma, I don't know how much of that you can actually just deal with through community. But I think that's something that we're trying to develop in the organization. But just personally, I just call up friends randomly a lot of the time and check in with them. And I'm like, hey, so what are you doing to take care of yourself? What are you doing that you love, that you enjoy? And, how are you making sure that you're not underwater basically and taking on too much stuff, because we need you to be here. We need people to be here for decades to come, possibly. And not just the next 2 years, but the next 20 or even longer. Hopefully not, but we need to be prepared for that. So I found that that's a good way of checking in with people, because I think there's a bad tendency that I still have, but not nearly as bad as I used to. And I know a lot of other people have had in the organization in the past, where we'd only talk to each other in moments of crisis or when we needed to like mobilize. And when you have that, I think there comes to be an association with each other of really negative feelings and grievances. If you're only mobilizing after, say another shooting happens or something like that, it's not healthy. And by focusing on talking to each other in non-crisis times, it's a good way of realizing that we're on the same side here. Right. And it helps reduce those like interpersonal conflicts and make sure that we're taking care of ourselves, which further helps to reduce those interpersonal conflicts. And it's just a good way of forming relationships, because ultimately, at that core of political powers I talked about in the past too, I think it's culture, but it's also that community and the fabric, like the strings that make up that community and weaves it together are relationships. And they're not relationships that are just made because you're only talking about work. They're made because you understand what's going on with each other, what's going on with each other's families, what's going on with each other's, significant others or whatever, and going on personally. And you're there to support them, even if it's not work related, because the best, I think those are the best type of activist, community relationships are the ones where they're not at their core. They're not just around, okay, we need to do X thing. It's around actually knowing what's going on with each other and understanding why we do this work and each other's motives and the challenges that each of us uniquely face.
Yeah. That's so true. Because then you have that foundation too. Like you said, that's not just focused on the mobilizing or the trauma, but that's kind of built throughout that. And I think, again, the research would back that up too. There's so many important pieces there. I'm curious if you feel like there's enough resources in place too. Because I mean, one of the, I don't do trauma work specifically, but I know one of the things that comes up quite a bit is making sure that people really know how to help other people walk through that. Because you get a lot of instances where people don't know how to handle that. So they have good intentions, but they actually just end up re-traumatizing people. I mean, we talked about that before I got on. It just even in terms of somehow some of the interviews that you've done and how it kind of gets back into that same thing over and over again. So I wonder if you all have even thought about that in terms of the movement. Like, do you feel like there are more resources? And obviously that's a challenge if resources are thin, but are there more resources that should be in place to help people actually process that trauma as they're engaged in the work, so that it's not, going into a place that's just making it that much more difficult, even with good intentions, but unintentionally?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that we certainly have more resources than we did in the past, but it's not nearly enough. I'm just talking about the movement as a whole, but I mean, which includes March for Our Lives. I think one of the difficulties is that we're so focused on spending the money like on the work that needs to be done. It can seem hard for us to justify, like, if we need to pay for a therapist, or like some kind of like community counselor or something. Even though, in my opinion, like resources are severely lacking, but honestly, the biggest obstacle besides the NRA to us actually being successful, I would say, is our trauma and the divisions that it creates. And it's hard to justify. It can be hard to justify to to donors or people that just give a small amount or whatever. Spending a couple $1,000, for example, and like helping reduce like community trauma and like all these things that sound very vague but really are important.
They are.
And managing better relationships and how to do those trainings instead of spending that money on registering, a couple hundred new voters or a couple thousand new voters or whatever, right? Even though the only reason why the overall return on investment, if that's really what we're talking about here, is significantly more if we're able to do more work and get more volunteers and develop a stronger community, if we're able to deal successfully with that trauma. But I would say, that's one of the difficult things is, honestly, if I could, I would, if we had the money to do it and people were more accepting of like understanding the importance of that, I would love to hire way more, HR people and like, not just HR, but like, I don't know what term to come up with that doesn't sound incredibly vague and like BS, but like, I guess like people that really help manage community wellness and like developing proper protocols between like how to train people, like, especially in the past year, since George Floyd and everything, like talking, it's difficult when there's kids from all different communities of all different races that oftentimes, have never really worked together in a social justice manner. They might've gone to school together and stuff, but like, the dynamics of racial identity and trauma in the United States and talking about it is something that a lot of, to be completely honest, just white kids do not understand at all. It's something that I'm still learning about, if I'm being completely honest, and I'm always trying to get better at it, but it's not something we're born knowing, especially, and we certainly don't learn it from society or the media. So yeah, I don't think we have necessarily at all enough resources to deal with that trauma, unfortunately, because it's hard to justify. But it's needed, and we have done some things around it. We try to have like occasion, somewhat, we try to give people time off, have retreats, and we try to be really affirming of when people need to, go on vacation and really celebrate that, because like, that's really good. This work is hard. It's really hard. And our issue is not that people don't want to do the work. It's that they want to do too much work.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, you're talking about a cultural shift too, because if some of those resources are needed, and I agree with you, that makes things better in the long run, but it doesn't look as shiny if you're trying to, if you're trying to raise money. It doesn't. Look like, it doesn't look like as much of an investment because you can't see that outcome right away. But
and it doesn't get on the news.
You can see what happens when it's not addressed. But
it's not, unfortunately, the work, a lot of the work that needs to be done in the organization and in the social justice space is not to end gun violence or address the things that play into gun violence, like racial justice or environmental injustice or economic injustice, are not things that necessarily get on the news super easily. For example, March this year committed to we have a $500,000 commitment to like grants and focus on mutual aid, providing food, clothing, whatever communities need, and going specifically to the Black and brown communities that are most impacted by gun violence, and asking them how we can be supportive to the, of the community organizations like Life Camp, who I'm wearing the shirt of right now. So doing the work on the ground, stopping kids from shooting each other, or everyday people from shooting each other. Instead of going to them and saying, this is what we're going to do for you. We're going to throw $10,000 at you, and you're just going to be happy. And like, we did our job, we're equitable or whatever. We're going to really ask, because we understand I don't know what goes on in, for example, Jamaica, Queens, where this shirt of Life Camp that I've worked with, I don't know what goes on there. Erica Ford, who's been doing this work for 20 years in Jamaica, Queens, and is stopping kids from shooting each other every day. She knows what needs to be done. Right. So we ask people like her, what can we do to be supportive? But even though there's that big commitment, which is a significant part of our budget, we're not like the NRA. We don't have $100 million budget or whatever a year at all. We get by, but it's still nothing in comparison to that. Even though there's that commitment and the work that comes out of it, it doesn't get on the news. So it's hard because like, we know that that's the work that needs to be done to actually be to help advance the movement forward. But it's also difficult because we know that a lot of that money, in comparison to spending it on something like, a big event or something, it's not going to get on the news, but we know that that's the work that needs to be done.
Exactly.
I think that's actually a really big problem with the nonprofit industrial complex. If I'm being completely honest, is that we have a system of incentives that incentivize people to do things that get on the news, even if they're not necessarily effective. Right. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen organizations spend 6, even 7 figures on things that could have been massively impactful for extremely under-resourced community organizations, and had a huge impact, but they choose instead to spend on something that's going to get on CNN or whatever, even though it's not going to have that much of an impact, in comparison to where that money actually really could go. So it's, it's difficult because we get questions of like, oh, what is March for Our Lives doing? It's like, well, we're focusing on these mutual aid programs. We're focusing on talking about what we call arms supremacy, right? Like the role of guns in white supremacist like circles and actions in the enforcement of white supremacy in the United States. We're talking about mental health, but not in a way that's like, not in a way where it's like, let's talk about the mental health of the shooter at my high school and why he decided to do that, and talk about that only because he's a white kid, right? And we tend to stereotype white mass shooters as mentally ill because we don't want to talk about the fact that they're a lot of the time, not always, but a significant amount of the time, it's simply, or not, I can't say simply, but it's in large part, if not entirely, because they're a racist. The shooter at my high school was racist and anti-Semitic. He was known to have drawn things like swastikas on stuff. And, I don't see that racism and anti-Semitism as a mental illness. But it's difficult because we want to talk about mental health in regards to the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides and don't get on the news, right? That's really what needs to be addressed. If we want to talk about addressing total gun deaths, we should be talking 2/3 of the time, if not more, about gun suicide. But because the mental health conversation is only around who a mass shooter is, I cannot tell you. I've had conversations before with kids that said like they were depressed, so they went through their school counselor, and their school counselor put them on a list saying that they were a possible mass shooter because they were depressed and they were worried about hurting themselves. Right? That is the effect that the media is having on these conversations. And it's so hard because we can't. Those conversations around armed supremacy, around mental health, but around suicide prevention and around, mutual aid and racial justice are not easy things to fit in a soundbite, like, universal background checks, which yes, can have an impact, but ultimately, isn't for a lot of cities that have stronger gun laws, although there's certainly a lack of federal ones. A lot of these guns that get there, quite frankly, get there illegally because there's a lack of like federal guidance around interstate gun trafficking that could actually prevent it. If it's extremely hard to get a gun in Chicago, or it's not necessarily as hard as it could be, but it's still hard nonetheless. You can just drive 30 minutes to Indiana and get a gun and come back, or some guy can go and buy 50 guns and sell them out of the back of his truck legally a lot of the time, on the south or west side, and have them go out that way. But what we need to address is, why do people on the south and west side feel the need to pick up a gun in the first place? It's because they don't have resources. Parkland has significantly weaker gun laws than Chicago or than many other cities in the country. We don't have shootings on a daily basis. And it's not because we have the most police officers or the most, stringent gun laws. It's because we have the most resources. And having those conversations those nuances are extremely hard to get across in a TV news interview, right? It doesn't fit into the neatly packaged trauma industrial media complex that commodifies these mass shootings, where they have graphics like it's some kind of baseball game or something, where it's like, this is how many people were, died. This is how it compares to other mass shootings and things like that, without any regard to the fact that most people that are going to die today from gun violence are self-inflicted gunshot wounds. They are unintentional shootings, and they're everyday acts of, of interpersonal gun violence and domestic violence. Right. That's what needs to get on the news, but doesn't. So it's difficult because what we need to do is over here, it's in one corner and we know what we need to do. But what actually enables people to get a good, like the nonprofit industrial complex, to get a return on investment so they can continue doing the work, might be in a completely different space. And there's plenty of people that do that. And then we get people asking, well, what are we doing? And the answer is we're doing more work than we ever have. And we're in the best place the organization, in my opinion, has ever been in terms of sustainability. But we're focusing on things that the news doesn't typically like to cover.
So, you're doing the real work, but it's not getting out there. And like you said, with the sound bites, so much of the truth gets lost too. Especially around the mental health conversations. All the evidence shows that those struggling with mental health are much more likely to be victims of gun violence than perpetrators.
Exactly.
Somehow that continues to get lost in the conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Those issues around funding are why we need more people to contribute. Like we'll tell you about the work that we do. It's just, you're not going to see it on CNN, even though it's way more important than the work that does get on CNN.
Yeah. Yeah. So, on that lines, like, what do you see as your role? Because there's that tension, which I think is just a theme of a lot of the work that you're doing. Because it's such important work and it's such a huge problem that tension is going to be there in a lot of ways. But how do you balance between what you're doing on the ground that is making an effect and making a difference versus what's getting the airtime, in a sense? Not that the airtime is important, but in some ways the airtime could help galvanize the work that's being done. So I don't know if you all have those conversations, if you're trying to wrestle with that.
Yeah, it's difficult. I think what we try to do is we're trying to make the organization more faceful instead of faceless, if that makes sense. And we're trying to show the other leaders in the organization that may not be from Parkland, but nonetheless, I would consider almost like co-founders of different marches, around the country. Yeah. One of them is like a board member of mine, a fellow youth board member of mine who just graduated college and is now a Truman Scholar named David Hogg. He's done a ton of work in gun violence prevention in Salt Lake City. And, we try to get him on the news, but it's difficult when the news wants to tell they want to put us in a box of like mainly white Parkland students and just that's it. When in reality, we realize in order to make this movement, our contribution to the movement, because we're by no means the movement, but make our contribution to the movement successful and as impactful as it can be, that it has to go beyond the border of Parkland. It has to be all encompassing of the United States. Yeah. And it's difficult because it's harder to tell a story that way because there's so many different communities, right? And there's so many different solutions that have to be talked about. But we realize that that's really the only way that can be done. The other thing that I do is when I'm doing interviews is, for example, yesterday I was on MSNBC and they're like, how are you, David? And all that stuff. And like, I care about that. Answer is, I'm not great. Honestly, I don't think anyone that's gone through an instance of gun violence is ever really great ever again. But what I always try to do is I try to redirect it towards people like Erica that have, in Jamaica, Queens, that have been doing this work for basically over 20 years at this point and are having a massive impact. It's talking about people like Pastor Mike that work with groups like Live Free and Faith in Action out in Oakland, California, that are doing the real work on the ground with cities and violence interrupters to redirect the conversation towards them. And I also see, because I'm able to get into a lot of these rooms because of, my profile or, the fact that I'm a white guy. And these rooms, even though the majority of people that are affected by gun violence tend to be like, black and brown, I see my role as helping up open, not, I hate this idea of a table because there shouldn't be a table to begin with, because that's like a whole power structure. Right. But what I see it as is trying to like kind of step back and put people in my place, or I guess help expand the table in some way, or I've lost track of the metaphor by this point, but you know what I mean? Like, I'm trying to use my position to basically bring in people like Erica a lot of the time into meetings and yell at these people, about like not being inclusive, not, doing these things properly. And it works, because of meetings that I've had before with other organizations or other coalition groups that were almost not entirely white, but were, almost entirely white. If we're in New York City and we're having a giant meeting 30 stories up in some building, but I know Erica's in Jamaica, Queens doing this work and she's not in that room and no one like Erica is in that room, that's a problem. Exactly. Right. So I see it as helping to, I don't know, I don't like the power dynamic of like shine a light on other communities, but I'm trying to expand the spotlight to include the communities that have been doing this work for decades that have to organize, not because they want to, because it's for their survival. It's for their literal survival that they do it. Activism is not optional for many people. For the majority of real activists that are out there, it is not optional. They have to do it for the community, their own survival or their community's survival. So that's what I see my role as, is trying to, acknowledge the amount of power that I have in this position, that quite frankly, much of which, is because of the work that I've done, but also a large amount of it is because I'm a white guy. And recognizing that the responsibility that power carries to acknowledge that and expand it to, or not expand it, but just, highlight the work that's been doing for and show respect to the people that have been doing the work for decades before me. And with that power, also use it to challenge other parts of the disproportionately white, piece at, the national gun violence prevention organizations, to challenge them to actually focus on things that aren't just around gun control, although it's needed, but talk about violence intervention programs. And because of things like that, Erica Ford and Pastor Mike and others, were at the White House in the Rose Garden, and Biden upped his commitment from, in our initial kind of peace plan that we came up with. I think we had we demanded like $1 billion, over several years or something to violence intervention programs. And because of the work that the Community Justice Action Fund and Amber Goodwin and others had been doing around that and in that space, and because of, I believe, because of part of March for Our Lives challenging these other organizations by highlighting the work that these orgs have been doing for way before any of us were here. Biden upped his commitment to $5 billion a year, or not $5 billion a year, to $5 billion over like 8 years to these programs that aren't policing based, but are public health based, and can actually help communities in the first place by providing trauma services and reducing retaliation and resources.
Nice. That's so neat.
And that's why I see my role is helping to challenge that dynamic. I'm by no means perfect. I still fuck up a lot. But I try to do the best that I can and acknowledge when I do fuck up and, continue to work through it. So,
I mean, I think that's great. I mean, it's a holistic approach in a lot of ways. Cause I keep using the word tension, but I feel like it's all there. Cause I mean, you've done the work, like that carries weight, but then you also know there's privilege, which you didn't necessarily earn.
There's a lot of it. There's a lot.
So, I mean, you're bringing those together. You're still making sure the people who have been doing the work on the ground are acknowledged. And so I think in a lot of ways, what you're talking about is walking alongside them. And I think that's important too. I
really see it as like,
I'm here being the one to kind of save you from your whatever X, Y, and Z.
No.
But I'm learning from you. I'm going to walk through it with you.
Right.
I'm going to come alongside you. I'm going to bring you where I am.
Yeah. And that's really the approach that I try to take. When I've worked with Erica in the past, for example, I just happened to be in New York for, different meetings and stuff. And I was like, I have a couple of days off or whatever. I'm going to spend it working with you. And I'm like, so, Erica, see me as an intern, like, you want water? I'm here to learn. I'm just here to observe. You want water? I'll get you water. You want coffee? I'll get you coffee. Like you need literally use me in whatever way you want. I just want to observe and learn from truly the best. So I don't even see it as walking alongside them. I see it as walking behind them and seeing them lead and learning from, the different paths that they've taken of how I can be supportive in that in the first place and highlight the work that they're doing, for lack of a better word. All these words, there's such a power dynamic and they're so loaded, like uplift, shine the spotlight, because there's such a, I don't like the power dynamic that's within that vernacular because it's not the power dynamic that like is productive to this conversation, because it comes from like a white saviorist place. Like that vernacular, is not only a white saviorist place, but also a white supremacist place in the first place, that implies a sense of entitlement and a belief that more about what to do for someone's community than the people that actually live in that community know what to do. Right. So it's difficult to talk about. But honestly, I just try to lead with humility and ask, how I can be supportive as much as possible, while acknowledging that, I do screw up from time to time, but trying to learn from those things and be forgiving with myself too, which is hard, especially with the kind of culture that we have on Twitter and social media that is not forgiving, a lot of the time.
Which again is completely unrealistic. As I'm sure you know, especially, this goes back to the first part of the conversation with everything that you've gone through already and everything that you're doing. Perfection is always unrealistic, but when you put all those pieces together, and we talked about this too, just about the trauma, it's just not even a healthy place to start. So I know we're still back to kind of this. There's a huge cultural shift that we need to have in a lot of ways, and in some ways, I think hopefully COVID has helped with that. Granted, COVID has not been a good thing by any stretch of the imagination. But I think in some ways it's helped people realize how a lot more of us react under stress and uncertainty, and knowing that, okay, there needs to be some room for forgiveness when things get stretched thin. And when people are in the middle of work after trauma, you need to have that grace and forgiveness to be able to move through things and say, okay, are things really getting addressed? Or are you putting these standards on people to go 1,000 miles an hour and hit unrealistic goals. And then if they have any little falter, then you just come down hard when you're not even walking through it yourself.
So. Right. And I mean, my thing is too, that, if the movement can't be, if we're too pure for ourselves, how are we ever going to have other people join in? Right. When like the way that we learn a lot of the time is these mistakes, unfortunately.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean that there's no accountability. There should be.
Yeah.
But there needs to be, a demand, not just for accountability, but true growth and learning. Because that's the only way that these things become successful. And I think it actually plays into the a bigger thing around how, although yes, our government has a much bigger role to play in ending gun violence and passing these laws and helping fund these programs, there's also a cultural role that we need to have and a reevaluation of why are we as a country so, obsessed with machines made to kill people. That's what they are, right? Why do we romanticize violence and stigmatize so many other things that are not like that? And it's I think it goes into not just a cultural aspect, because the way I see ending gun violence is it's like, I think about a third of it is like the gun laws. I think a third of it is like different things about how do we stop people from wanting guns in the first place. But another third is the cultural aspect that we have to acknowledge the fact that although our government is corrupt in a number of, in many ways, ultimately our government is a product of not all of us because of rampant voter suppression, but many of us. And it is a reflection of our values as a society. As a society, we need to either reaffirm or change some of what we truly reprioritize, what we truly do value, in order to do that. And I think that comes down to a whole conversation too around justice. And I truly believe that if we want to end gun violence, we need to acknowledge that gun violence is a symptom of injustice. If we don't address that injustice, if we can't make an unjust country, will never be a peaceful country, ever. And we have to talk about those resources and the systemic injustice that causes this gun violence in the first place. Even though it's not easy to fit into a soundbite, it really is the only way we're ever going to end this in the first place.
Yeah, that's so well said. So important. And you're right. I mean, it's not easy. I think that's part of the challenge that you all are trying to deal with head on. So, but I mean, I'm encouraged to hear about the organization, still thriving in a lot of ways, even outside of the public eye in a sense. And some of the structures that have been put in place, especially around the delegation, especially around the self-care. Because again, I think that's important for the life for the organization. And like you all said, the life of the community. And the life of the communities that are doing this work. I would imagine, those you've mentioned have been doing this for 20 plus years. Those pieces have to be in place in some shape or form. The community piece and the self-care. Otherwise, with everything that there and we're already into is just not going to be sustainable. So
I mean, it's a big focus of the organization too. Part of the reason why that the media is lacking and stuff is that we rely, as I said in the past previously too, that stuff that gets on CNN isn't necessarily what ends us, but it's we're focused on doing more and saying less, because ultimately, the time that we spend talking is time that we could be spending registering voters. It's time that we could be spending helping raise money for community organizations and building coalitions instead of competing against other nonprofits and stuff, which I think is a horrible product of the hyper-capitalistic nonprofit industrial complex that has been developed around treating symptoms like gun violence instead of addressing causes of gun violence in the first place. But it's all the more reason why we need people to help fund us, because we're not getting, we may not be getting on CNN, but we're registering voters. We're doing the real work. And we've seen the product of that in the past couple of years. Yeah,
that's really encouraging to hear. And I appreciate us taking us through the journey too, even in terms of from the beginning where you are now. One thing I do want to do before we wrap up though is just in terms of folks who might be listening who are saying, okay, I want to know more about either what's going on in my community or how I can help with some of these more national initiatives. Like where would you direct people in terms of really making an impactful difference and not just going for the shine factor or tokenism or anything else like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the best thing that you could probably do in general, where there's a lot of resources available, is just going to the March for Our Lives website. It's just March for Our Lives, like marchforourlives.com. And there you can register to vote if you're not. But you can also text our 954-954 text code that can let you know about local events, elections, and things like that, that our chapters and and coalitions are working on in your area. And you can see a lot of the work that March is doing that may not necessarily be getting on CNN, but is, even more important than the stuff that gets on the news. So yeah, that's really what I would say. And, just try to do as much as you can. At minimum, try to make it voting if you have the privilege, because unfortunately voting is not a right in this country, I would argue, for many people that have been incarcerated. But if you have that ability to vote, please do so at the minimum. And if you're able to do more, try to do more. Get involved with, local community organizations. Just look up like gun violence prevention organization or whatever in your city. If you're in New York, Life Camp's a great one that I would suggest. They're in Jamaica, Queens. There's also Save Our Streets in the Bronx. There's Live Free and Faith in Action in Oakland and in the San Francisco area. There's in Los Angeles, I'm trying to think of what it's called. I forget. There's a number of organizations. There's a lot of organizations that do this work in LA too that you can look up. But yeah, just, try to figure out how to get involved. And even if it's just in a small manner, just do it consistently, even if it's just voting, try to vote in every election. Even if it's just, trying to volunteer or help out in any way, or working on a campaign of a candidate that really runs on gun violence prevention. We need more people to do that because we have the disadvantage of not having several $100 million like the NRA does, but we have the advantage of having way more people that support us, in general. But we need those people to be much more out there because the NRA is a extremely loud but effective. They're small but extremely loud and effective minority. And if we could just figure out how to get a small percentage of our country mobilized around this issue, we'd easily end it in 10 years or less, way less.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you sharing all those resources and all that great advice. I mean, there's so many different opportunities for people to really jump in and do the work that needs to be done. And the work is already being done in a lot of ways. So,
right. Yeah.
Well, appreciate you coming on the Addy Hour and taking us through. I mean, we covered a lot of ground, so a lot of important ground, but really appreciate kind of hearing the journey and what you have going for, and continue to wish you the best in this important work, especially the work that's not getting airplay. I mean, I think that's where the real work is being done in a lot of ways, but hopefully, with some of these pieces, things will continue to get galvanized. Glad you're taking care of yourself too. I mean, as we've
well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's been great.